United States, France, and Germany have outlawed war. Yeah, that's right. War is now against the law. Now, this has nothing to do with Putin and invading the Ukraine. This was done in 1928 with the signing of the Kellogg-Briand Pact on August 27, 1928. By July of 1929, 30 other countries joined the Peace Pact. It was now against international law to wage war. There was just one problem. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was worthless. It was just a scrap of paper. By the mid-1930s, fascism, militarism were on the rise in Europe and Asia. The United States realized another global conflict was on the rise. August 31st, 1935, Congress passed the first Neutrality Act prohibiting the export of arms, ammunition, and implements of war from the United States to foreign nations at war, and requiring arms manufacturers to the United States to apply for an export license. American citizens traveling in the war zone were also advised that they did so at their own risk. Now, most intelligent people realized another war was in the making, and in the U.S. our Congress believed the only way to stay out of it was passing the Neutrality Act. 1935, Italy was preparing to invade Ethiopia. Now, Japan had been involved in Manchuria for almost 4 years, waging an aggressive war, and Adolf Hitler was rearming Germany in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. The League of Nations, they were proving to be ineffective and useless. The first Neutrality Act was a rush job, passed at the end of the congressional term. Many people were against it. Some believed it just wasn't strong enough. Others believed it would hinder the United States' ability to support friendly nations. The Neutrality Act was reauthorized in 1936 with the addition of denying credit and loans to belligerent countries. Now in 1937, the act was extended to cover civil wars. Spain was fighting a civil war at that time. Plus, U.S. ships were prohibited from transporting any passengers or articles to belligerent nations, and U.S. citizens were forbidden from traveling on ships of belligerent nations. However, President Roosevelt was able to have a provision added that allowed for the president to permit the sale of materials and supplies to belligerents in Europe as long as the recipients arranged for the transportation and paid immediately with cash. This provision was known as cash and carry. It was clearly devised to help England and France in the event of war with Germany.
I now ask again that such action be taken in respect to that part of the Act which is wholly inconsistent with ancient precepts of the laws of nations, the embargo provisions. I ask it because they are, in my opinion, most vitally dangerous to American neutrality, American security, and above all, American peace. These embargo provisions, as they exist today, prevent the sale to a belligerent by an American factory the sale of any completed implements of war. But they allow the sale of many types of uncompleted implements of war, as well as all kinds of general material and supplies. They furthermore allow such products of industry and agriculture to be taken in American flag ships to belligerent nations. There in itself, under the present law, lies definite danger to our neutrality and our peace. From a purely material point of view, what is the advantage to us in sending all manner of articles across the ocean for final processing there, when we could give employment to thousands by doing it here? Incidentally, and again, from the material point of view, by such employment here, we automatically aid in building up our own national defense.
By 1938, Roosevelt ordered Chief of Naval Operations, CNO Admiral William Leahy, to begin the reconditioning of the mothballed Great War destroyers for service in the Atlantic. Now, these were called four stackers or four pipers because they had four smokestacks. Also, he created the Atlantic Squadron under Rear Admiral Johnson. The original complement of ships for the squadron were 7 light cruisers, 7 destroyers. Not quite enough to patrol the East Coast. Never mind the area Roosevelt had envisioned. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and in response to this invasion, England and France declared war on September 3rd, 1939. Roosevelt immediately went on the radio to reassure the nation.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral has a right to take account of facts. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or close his conscience. I have said not once, but many times, that I have seen war and that I hate war. I say that again and again. I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will. And I give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end. As long as it remains within my power to prevent, there will be no blackout of peace in the United States.
Then on September 4th, 1939, Chief of Naval Operations issued the following orders. Office of Chief of Operations. Orders. Commander Atlantic Squadron to establish as soon as possible a combined air and ship patrol to observe and report in cipher the movement of warships of warring nations east from Boston along a line to 42 degrees 30 minutes north, 65 degrees 0 minutes west, then south to 19 degrees north, then around the seaward outline of the Windward and Leeward Islands to the British islands of Trinidad. Roosevelt then issued Presidential Proclamation number 2348 outlining America's neutrality. In this document, he made it clear to all belligerents, meaning Germany, what the U.S. would do if a belligerent ship was found in American waters. Quote, I do hereby further declare and proclaim that any frequenting and use of the waters within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States by the vessels of a belligerent power, whether public ships or privateers, for the purpose of preparing for hostile operations or as posts of observation upon the ships of war or privateers or merchant vessels of an opposing belligerent, must be regarded as unfriendly and offensive and in violation of that neutrality which it is the determination of this government to observe, and to the end that the hazard and inconvenience of such apprehended practices may be avoided. Okay, then he went even further on September 6, 1939. Roosevelt's press secretary announced a naval patrol extending out 200 to 300 miles off the East Coast. On September 8th, President Roosevelt issued Proclamation number 2352, proclaiming a national emergency in connection with the observance, safeguarding, and enforcement of neutrality and the strengthening of the national defense within the limits of peacetime authorizations. The National Guard, as well as Army and Navy reservists, were being called up. President Roosevelt did emphasize that these call-ups would not exceed the authorized peacetime limits of the services. Ironically, while Congress debated the Neutrality Act of 1939, Roosevelt had his State Department organize the Panama Conference. Now, this conference consisted of the United States and all the Latin American republics. The goal was to agree to a security zone in the Americas. They first met on September 23rd, and by October 3rd, 1939, the United States and the other neutral nations of South America and Central America signed the Declaration of Panama, setting up the Pan American Security Zone. The signatories agreed not to tolerate belligerent acts within the zone, which extended from the U.S. border to encompass the Americas to the south up to 1,000 nautical miles from the shore. The act mostly benefited the Allies. Its purpose was to restrict German U-boat activity in much of the Western Atlantic. The patrol was not much of a deterrent in the beginning. Now, Congress passed a final Neutrality Act in November of 1939, better late than never. Now, this act lifted the arms embargo and put all trade with belligerent nations under the terms of cash and carry. But the ban on loans remained in effect, and American ships were barred from transporting goods to belligerent ports. America was going to stay out of the war, and the U.S. Navy was going to make sure the belligerents stayed away from our coast. There was just line extended from Boston down to Trinidad. The object of the patrol was to report the presence of any belligerent ships. Okay, the reason for the Navy's deficiency are many. There was the reduction of military spending in the 20s and 30s, manpower shortages, the lack of proper training, the lack of proper auxiliary ships and bases to support an operation of this size, but most importantly, the combat ships themselves. The Navy was focusing on Japan and the Pacific. The Atlantic Squadron consisted of 1 aircraft carrier and 4 old battleships and 4 heavy cruisers, and 29 destroyers. The squadron was not capable of effectively carrying out the mission of neutrality patrols, but they did it anyways to the best of their ability. Now, at first, the patrols would have covered just 200 miles of the East Coast. The patrols were only to report on belligerent ships after they had left the area and to report in code. Now, the Navy wanted to avoid any suggestion that the U.S. was helping the Allies. Roosevelt had a direct line installed at the White House to the Director of Ship Movements, and a large chart was set up in the Oval Office. Roosevelt wanted to keep track of his ships and the squadron's activities. By mid-September, Roosevelt arbitrarily extended the neutrality zone to 60 degrees west longitude. This line ran between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and ran south 270 miles east of Bermuda and ended at the tip of British Guiana. The Navy barely had the ships, planes, and men or facilities to cover the original 200 miles off the eastern seaboard. Now, Roosevelt extended the zone out to the 60th longitude. The Navy estimated it would take 290 ships and up to 4,000 airplanes to do the job properly. Well, with not enough ships and not enough experienced men, the Neutrality Patrol was put into action. Now, the patrols were organized into 7 patrol areas with a reserve force at Hampton Roads, Virginia. Now, the reserve force had the battleships USS Arkansas, Texas, and New York, with the aircraft carrier USS Ranger and Squadron BB-4, BF-4, BS-41, and BS-42 embarked on them. This force would support the 7 patrolling forces on the eastern seaboard. Now, the original patrol complements were Patrol 0, that was Destroyer Division 18, at the USS David, Jewett, Benham, Elliott, and they were assigned Patrol Station 0 from Newfoundland to south to the 40th parallel. Patrol 1, Destroyers Hamilton, Leary were assigned Patrol Station 1 along a northwest-southeast line off Georges Bank. Patrol Area 2, Destroyers USS Hopkins and Goff, with aircrafts of Patrol Squadron VB-54 and Seaplane Tender USS Owl operating from Newport, Rhode Island, between the 38th and 43rd parallels. Patrol 3, Destroyers USS Manly, Barry, Decatur, and Reuben James. They patrolled between the 34th and 38th parallel with aircrafts of VP-52, VP-53. Patrol Area 6 destroys Babbitt, Claxton patrolled the Florida Straits out to the Yucatan Channel. Patrol 7 and 8 were the cruisers USS San Francisco and Tuscaloosa, with the destroyers Bromie, Bory, and Simpson, and Truxton. They patrolled the Eastern Caribbean south of the 23rd parallel with aircraft from VP-33 and VP-51, supported by seaplane tenders Lapwing, Gannett, and Thrush. Gannett and Thrush established a seaplane base in Puerto Rico. Patrol 9 were the cruisers USS Quincy and Vincennes. They patrolled 300 miles off the coast between Newport and Cape Hatteras. The Navy was doing its job methodically and by the book. That did not suit the president. By October, Roosevelt was losing his patience with the Navy. He sent a scathing memorandum listing 3 major issues he wanted rectified and fast. The establishment of the patrol was too slow. The lag time between making contacts and follow-up contacts was unacceptable. The liaison between the Navy, Coast Guard, and State Department was very weak. He issued 4 clear-cut orders to the Navy Department. Patrol operations will be rushed to completion. Submarine sightings will be immediately rushed to the Navy Department and action taken. Suspected vessels will be followed day and night. All reports will be sent in plain English. No code will be used. Now, the reason Roosevelt ordered that all sightings reports be sent in plain English is not to save time by eliminating encoding and decoding. That order was given so British warships could listen in, they could locate and destroy the enemy vessels. Not a very neutral thing to do, but it was very smart on Roosevelt's part. Now, in Mr. Abaziz's book, Roosevelt's Navy, he listed the total amount of ships sighted from October through December 1939. In the month of October, 1,072 ships were sighted, with 136 ships sighted but not identified. November, 1,924 ships sighted, with 178 sighted but not identified. December, 2,648 ships were identified, while 241 ships sighted but not identified. Now, these sightings were mostly merchant traffic. Now, the procedure for identifying ships was straightforward. The captain of the destroyer would hail the ship by radio or megaphone and ask for an identification. Most ships replied. However, there were a few that would refuse just on principle. There was one encounter between the ships of Patrol Area 6 and the Australian cruiser Perth. Squadron commander repeatedly asked Perth to identify herself. The Perth's captain repeatedly responded, "A British warship." Now, that was in Mr. Abzay's book on page 69. Most of the destroyers assigned to the patrols were the old four-pipers from the Great War, which were hastily built. Think of Detroit and the infamous Monday cars and Friday cars. These ships had been mothballed quickly after the war, and in a number of cases the mothballing procedures were done badly. So to bring these ships up to active status quickly required full crews that had experience. That was not the case. The majority of these crews were just out of basic training or reservists. What few old hands were available were siphoned off to new construction. Most captains found themselves with a crew of inexperienced officers and men. The age of the destroyers, the inexperience of the men, quickly began to show. The patrols in the northern latitude experiencing rough seas and freezing weather. This caused equipment failure, seasickness. However, these inexperienced crews were quickly learning seamanship and the art of naval warfare. In the book Mr. Roosevelt's Navy by Patrick Abaziz, he explained that even though the new men were lacking experience and knowledge, the captains soon found the youngsters and reservists to be damn fine men who qualified for most important duties about as quickly as academy-trained novices. Treat them for what they are, a select bunch of men who have volunteered to join us, and we are lucky to have them. Train them at every opportunity. Encourage rather than heckle. Make it clear to your officers and chief petty officers that their ship and their lives may depend on these reservists becoming good officers and men. The biggest complaint from the destroyer captains and squadron commanders was not the lack of experience of their men, but the lack of training for their crews. Individual patrolling did not allow for gunnery training, or even squadron training. The Atlantic Squadron was originally more of a training squadron. The sailors would be trained, then sent to the Pacific Fleet or the Asiatic Fleet. Even though the squadron was doing neutrality patrols, it was still being used to train and man the other fleets. Now, under these difficult conditions, the Asiatic Squadron was shaping up. The crews were learning their jobs, albeit the hard way. The patrols had the desired effect on Germany. The American public, blissfully unaware of just how unprepared the Navy was for war, was happy that the U.S. Navy was keeping the war from our shores. By the end of 1939, the practice of sighting, identifying radio positions in plain English was working. For each incident of the Neutrality Patrol reporting a British ship in the Gulf of Mexico, several German ships were intercepted by the Royal Navy units responding to the American reports. Of 211 German merchant ships attempting to return to Germany during the last 4 months of 1939, only 32, 37% of the 85 ships leaving the Western Hemisphere through the declared neutrality zone were successful. As with any emergency, in the beginning, the excitement kept the crews engaged, but as the months wore on, the excitement turned into routine. With routine comes monotony, which reduces efficiency. Coupling that problem with the lack of proper support facilities to maintain the patrol made this job extremely difficult. Things were going to change quickly. Now, the German blitzkrieg into the West in May of 1940 pushed the British back to the beaches of Dunkirk. The British Expeditionary Force was looking at total defeat and a surrender of its entire professional army, an army Britain would need to turn its young civilian men into soldiers. The task of saving the British Army fell to the Royal Navy. Between May 26 and June 4th of 1940, the British Navy was able to evacuate 338,000 men out of a total of 390,000 in the BEF. Now, during the evacuation, the British lost a number of their destroyers, which were needed for the Atlantic convoys. Churchill turned to Roosevelt for help. The U.S. Navy had 170 flush-decker World War I destroyers in and out of commission. Churchill wanted 50 of them. By June of 1940, American public opinion on the war was shifting. More and more Americans felt the aid to Britain was acceptable as long as the U.S. stayed out of the war. Now, even though the American public was willing to support Britain, members of Congress were not. There was a small problem: the Neutrality Act. See, cash and carry clause of the Neutrality Act was not enough to justify giving the British warships. Roosevelt needed to do an end run around Congress. Roosevelt and his advisors spent the summer of 1940 working on the problem. By August of 1940, Attorney General Robert Jackson issued an opinion on the deal. The pertinent part of the opinion states, Section 4, accordingly, you are respectfully advised, A, that the proposed arrangement may be concluded as an executive agreement, effective without awaiting ratification. B, that there is presidential power to transfer title and possession of the proposed consideration upon certification by appropriate staff officers. The certification by appropriate staff officers was going to be just a little difficult. Congress had recently enacted a statute tying the hands of the president. Under this statute, the president could not give military equipment to foreign powers unless the appropriate staff officer certified the equipment was obsolete and had no military value. The appropriate staff officer in this instance was the new Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark. Stark had to certify to Congress that the World War I destroyers were of no military value, even though the U.S. Navy was using a number of these reactivated destroyers in the fleet for frontline service. Now, in the end, Stark was able to do the end around, certify the 50 destroyers as no use for the U.S. military. On September 3rd, 1940, the U.S. Navy transferred 50 old destroyers to Britain. Now, in return, the British granted the United States 99-year leases on bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. One day later, the first 8 American destroyers left Boston Harbor, and by the 9th, they were in Halifax. British crews came aboard that day. The last group of 4 stackers were commissioned in the Royal Navy on the 26th of November, 1940. The debate in America was contentious. Now, when the deal was announced, the isolationists in Congress took their knives out and let loose on the president. The September 4th, 1940 edition of the Washington Evening Star wrote, "The isolationist senators, 9, Republican, North Dakota, stated, a direct act of war in violation of our treaties, statutes, and international law. The House could bring impeachment action." Senator Clark, a Democrat from Ohio, stated, "One of the last steps on the road to inevitable war. Whatever the bases are worth should be charged against the unpaid war debt. We should keep the destroyers." Representative Gerhardt, he's a Republican from California, stated, "The whole performance is amazing. In view of the importance of this matter, it should have been submitted to Congress, notwithstanding the fact that the President had legalistic authority to proceed without it." Now, Thorelson, a Republican from Montana, stated, "I think this is the most atrocious and unconstitutional act that any president ever could have negotiated on the Constitution. Not even Congress has the power to dispose of our first line of defense. Acquisition of these leased air bases is simply an excuse to provide entrance for us into this war. England is using the United States, as she always has done, to build up her own defenses at the expense of this country's taxpayers." Grant, a Republican from Indiana, stated, "This is the sorriest day in our history and the biggest step we've taken towards the brink of war. Only a mere formality of declaration of war remains. It was a done deal, as the newspapers wrote. Congress had no say in the matter. Did the isolation in Congress actually believe that the U.S. would stay out of the war? Or were they pandering for votes and political power? I don't know. Some things never change. In any event, these bases greatly expanded the Navy's capability to maintain the Neutrality Patrol. They would also become very important bases during the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, as for the destroyers, I believe it was in Philip Goodhart's book, 50 Ships That Saved the World. Goodhart related the reactions of the British sailors when they took over the ships. The British sailors were astonished to see the galleys stocked with steaks, eggs, butter, ice cream, and Lucky Strike cigarettes, all food which had been rationed since the start of the war. On the journey back to England in the rough seas of the Atlantic, one British sailor complained about the seaworthiness of his new ship and said, "I know we've eaten all their steaks and smoked all their Lucky Strikes, but can't we give the Yanks a carton of players and some bully beef to cancel the steal?" One more important change would happen in December of 1940. With the monotony of the patrol, crew morale was at a low point. Now, to change things, CNO Admiral Stark placed Admiral King in command of the Atlantic Squadron. Admiral King was a no-nonsense, by-the-book commander who would throw away the book when he believed it was wrong, as far as he was concerned. Now, when he took command in December of 1940, he issued 4 orders. The first order, December 20th, 1940, dealt with the measures necessary to place ships on a war emergency basis. The second focused on daily exercise at general quarters and damage control while at sea, as well as close attention to orders and instructions. The third order was devoted to the exercise of command by officers in this period of wartime. And the fourth basically was titled, "Making the Best of What We Have." By February 41, the squadron was redesignated the Atlantic Fleet. King became Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet. During this period, the British were at rock bottom as far as money was concerned for paying for any more war material. Roosevelt's next big step was to propose Lend-Lease.